You're listening to Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the we try latest news in our industry with a group of biotech insiders. I'm Sam Fazeli, and my co-hosts today are Brian Skorney, who's here. We are still waiting for Paul Matteis and Tess Cameron. For more information about our hosts and guest speakers, or to listen to the most recent episode, please go to biotechhangout.com. And a happy new year to everybody. It is my pleasure to open the first session of the year. So we're looking forward to enjoying a whole new 2026 full of energy, hopefully the same pace that it started the year. Normally we start with politics, market sentiment, etc. So let's just do that, exactly that. So XBI is up for the obvious reasons because it's been M&A deals and we've had an IPO that, by all intents and purposes, is successful, which is great news. And we talk about the M&A, etc. And we're on I could say, the eve of JPM, because we won't be from a working day perspective, we're close to on the eve of JPM. So, Brian, did you want to just quickly catch us up on how you feel the year has started off in terms of your what you've been seeing, the data you've been seeing, and the news that you've been seeing?
Yeah, so I think it started off a little bit manic, as one is kind of used to with the biotech tape. You had some big underperformance days, some really big outperformance days. We're 1 week into the year, and we see some modest outperformance for the XBI, but could have looked another day, and you would think it's a slow start to the year, at least in terms of where the market's going. I think sentiment is good overall. I mean, we had a really monster last 4 or 5 months to the year, and I think people have a mix of hope and a mix of confidence that we're going to see, to some extent, continuation there. We've spoken a lot about this. I'm pretty bullish on 2026 as a whole. I think the sector is certainly not an expensive sector relative to a lot of other parts of the equity markets. And I think we've seen a lot of data catalysts, a lot of M&A, a lot of enthusiasm really play out here. You talked a lot about drug pricing reform. So, we have like our sector preview out today, and we go through a lot of these themes. And I think, I know that I particularly have some very unique view, but I think sort of my view and call it the average consensus view among investors is it's going to be a good year for outperformance of biotech. And look, I mean, we've seen a pretty busy week. One of the comments we sort of had internally is, it seems like things get pulled forward earlier and earlier in the year. Obviously, JPM is sort of the pilgrimage that we all make to start the year and get updates. And it's probably a few years ago where people started announcing things earlier than JPM. But this is kind of the first year, and I haven't put together data on this specifically to say this, but it feels, at least from an observer perspective, that you're just seeing a lot more deals also occur. Versus we used to see a lot of follow-ons really get priced after JP Morgan. So, maybe in addition to people feeling that they want to be early on the curve on the news, it seems like companies are also looking to be early on the follow-on front. Certainly, I imagine we'll continue to see a lot of deals over the next 2-3 weeks, and at some point there'll probably be a level of investor exhaustion. I know, talking to the buy side, I think they're pretty much busier this week than maybe they traditionally are.
Well, that's great news, I think. And as you said, XBI is trading at, where are we at now? 125.53 on my terminal. And the last time we were around this level was the 10th of November, 2021. And that was us still coming off the excitement of COVID, and that COVID's going to make everybody really super appreciate the pharmaceutical industry, which didn't quite happen, and it kind of went in the opposite direction. Tess and Paul, very nice to see you here. I was beginning to sweat under the collar a little bit. So, do you want to guys take turn, or ladies first, Tess, and then Paul on in the general topic about how you're feeling for the year? I mean, 9th of January, Tess.
Yes, absolutely. Happy to. I think feeling feeling relatively positive. I think that we've seen a lot of really strong fundamental progress in 2025 that that drove valuations. Our team is actually going to be coming out with a report over the next day or two that summarizes some of our overarching thoughts about the sector. But what you'll see in that report is if we look at the returns for 2025, M&A certainly contributed to returns, but the returns were actually really strong, even if we take out M&A, which is obviously something that I think is really important and really encouraging. Is that companies that made strong fundamental progress were rewarded. And so, I'm hopeful that that theme, contributes, continues this year. Maybe, hopeful is a better word than necessarily optimistic for me. We do have we do have continued policy overhang, right? We saw the CMS demo come out with, with MFN. I'm sure, that's probably going to be litigated. We'll likely have to see how that plays out to see if that, is introduced and really comes into play as a pricing, as a pricing risk. I think that likely impacts, companies with existing products more than companies that are launching new products and really have yet to make a pricing decision. But I think that is probably the major, the major kind of continued unknown variable in 2026 is what could kind of pop up from a policy standpoint that could surprise to the downside. I think
What's
the
interesting
fundamental
though,
progress
Tess,
is very encouraging, and companies are really well capitalized to keep advancing.
what's interesting is that the stock prices didn't bat an eyelid to that. And I mean, I've gone on record saying that the MFN dust has settled. Maybe that was premature, but no, but nothing happened. The market just moved on. So
And it's so
I
interesting,
found that
Sam.
interesting.
It really is, and it makes me maybe other people have different perspectives. I think that could be for one of two reasons. One reason could be that people look at that and they're like, yeah, whatever. It's like not actually going to happen and not actually going to get implemented, which is a bit like the taco trade, the taco trade thesis. Um, and then I think there is another perspective that I don't think is the right perspective, which is like, oh, well, if this gets implemented, it's not really any problem because maybe companies in the U.S. are just going to raise their drug prices in the U.S. to compensate for the fact that they are no longer going to launch in Germany because the German price would have too much of an adverse impact on their price in the U.S. I don't necessarily agree with that perspective. I don't think that any U.S. pharmas or biotechs are really leaving, a lot of pricing room on the table in the U.S. I think they're, trying to price what what works efficiently from a market perspective. So I think that has yet to, the if MFN actually becomes a thing, I think we might see some surprises. But perhaps the lack of market reaction just indicates that there's little expectation that would actually be implemented.
Right, Paul, have a go at your start of the year. Came back with a major excitement all around.
Yeah. No, great week. Hey, good to see everybody. Sorry, I had to re-download the X app and then do a forgot password. It's always pleasant to do that at 11:59. So my bad. But yeah, good to see everybody. I mean, I think like it's hard not to feel mostly optimistic for the year, right? It feels like we're in a good place of strength in the sector. Going to see more M&A, right? I mean, I sound like the cliche sell side analyst, right? Bullish, more M&A, but in general, like I really feel that way. I think Tess, what you're talking about is interesting because I just think at this point, like investors, right or wrong, have become so jaded to drug pricing headline risks that probably is a real risk to the downside because I think it takes a lot now to get people to take something like that seriously. But if something significant comes along, I mean, I think that really could take the wind out of our sails. But I mean, separately, like, I feel good about a lot of companies in my coverage. I think we're continuing to see strong commercial launches from the big guys, data sets getting rewarded. So, we'll see how JP Morgan Monday looks. Maybe the RevMed deal takes some pressure off of needing like some big M&A. But yeah, I mean, I sort of agree with what everyone said.
I just wanted to add another, a couple other data points that are going to be coming out in our report. I think something else that's really important for the performance in 2025 is that it was not like indiscriminate performance, right? It was not consistent across the whole sector. It was really driven by, strong companies, and we, we'll often do this analysis where we compare, companies that had specialist investors, versus companies that didn't, right? And you assume that maybe there's a bit more selection, specialists are, doing a lot of fundamental diligence, and maybe that's a way that you can, have some indicator of quality. Obviously, there's some companies without specialist investors that have performed well. But when we look at the performance of those that had specialist investors versus didn't, there was still a lot of like discrimination in the market. And there were a lot of companies that like really didn't perform. And, fortunately, the companies that did perform really drove the outperformance of the sector. But I think that again speaks to, overall sector health.
Yeah, of course, we'll get to talk about the mooted, what do I know, rumored deals. I have to choose my words very carefully. Of course, we all do. Revolution Medicine, Merck, etc. So let's just, before we go there, on the policy side of things, Tess, I think you wanted to raise the subject, which is I'm very passionate about myself, but it gets to, you start losing the will, the energy to keep talking about this, and that's the pediatric vaccines developments in the US.
Absolutely. Yeah, so this was an update from the CDC, where the CDC removed 6 vaccines, from the recommended list, and they did that without any ACIP discussion or recommendation. So that was, rotavirus, COVID-19, influenza, meningococcal, hepatitis A, hepatitis B. All of those got removed. HPV down to a single dose. It's kind of like, where did this come from? And like, is ACIP doing anything? Now, fortunately, like there's a couple ways where you could say like, wow, okay, this is going to have a negative impact. Certainly on just what parents are actually seeking for their children, but then also insurance coverage. I think importantly, there isn't any change, or at least we don't anticipate any change to insurance coverage for those vaccinations. But this could absolutely have an impact on just vaccination rates and what parents are getting for their kids. As you say, and as Paul has said, it seems like everyone's just kind of like, oh my gosh, like another kind of vaccine recommendation that isn't scientifically based. Maybe we're getting, maybe we're getting a bit immune to that. But it is like, it does really cause me to question, like, what does it take for us to remember that these are real risks, right? And these are real risks, not just to our sector, but these are real risks to, to public health. So,
Yeah.
yet another change introduced from a stock standpoint. You saw Vaxcyte, I think, actually go up on the day, because it kind of removed a worst case scenario of pneumococcal, pneumococcal potentially being in that list, that was going to be taken off the schedule.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I think is at least worth saying is that it's not the worst set of recommendations in the world. It's pretty much in line. I haven't done a line by line comparison with what happens in Denmark, so I think that's. But Denmark is a very different type of society to, and access to healthcare is very different to that in the US. So if that's the intention, to try and equalize it relative to that particular country for whatever reason, then I think it's missing out a whole bunch of other aspects that are important from the perspective of public health and how public health is administered in the different countries. So we will wait and see. And of course, the states in the US can have their own rules. And I think there are groups that have taken over, like the American Pediatric Association, from essentially ACIP, because I think a lot of people feel that ACIP is not, at least the physician side of people, not delivering what it used to be doing. So let's move on to, unless anybody wants to make another comment here, deals and fundraisings. I'm going to start with the IPO of Aktis. I think the folks on this call weren't on the book, so feel free to chip in. What's interesting, of course, is that it's a great start to the year. I was a little bit surprised thinking we've got a company that has no clinical data yet. I mean, they have a clinical product. It's in phase 1B, data expected possibly end of this year into 2027, I think is the target. But the radioligand therapies, very novel approach to radioligand therapies. So I was a little bit worried when it was when it was coming up, and I thought, do we really want to start with this? Should we not have a company with a bunch of data in hand? But hats off to them; they've done a great job. They priced at $18. The range was 16 to 18. Good tick number one. Tick number two, they raised more than they expected. $318 million in the end is the number I've got at least. And it's opened up. So it opened up at about 27 and it's now settling down around 22, 23. Remember, $18 issue. All of that is a great sign. And the investors are a good set of investors bringing the company to market. And of course, $100 million or so has come from Lilly, given that they had a deal with the company. So Lilly has a deal with the company and puts money into it. So I think that tells you a lot. Apparently, the book was 10 times. Just very quickly, the company's last raise was in September, I think 2024, $175 million Series B, RA Capital, RTW, Janus Henderson. And then, of course, they were already alongside existing investors, T. Rowe Price, Avidity, and Lilly, and Bristol Myers. So there's a very good set of investors here, which are including, and also Merck Venture Fund. So the approach is different. It's a radioligand therapy, but it's not just any radioligand therapy. They're not using existing known peptides. They're using mini proteins, I think they call them. And they have a discovery platform for these mini proteins. They had a deal with Lilly, signed on the 21st of May, $60 million upfront, 1.1 billion milestones. And we've seen the split is about 50-50 between development milestones and commercial milestones. So that's pretty good. And it's an area where they've shown already that in patients they get the right distribution into the tumors, etc. And the first one they've got in the clinic is a Nectin-4, which we know that if you attach a drug to it in the form of Padcev, you get really good quality results it was a revolution essentially in bladder cancer when it first reported out. So everything's good here. Let's just hope that the data continues to be good. One little thing that I've been looking around for, which is anti-drug antibodies. These are designed proteins, novel proteins, 50 to 75 amino acids apparently, and I couldn't find any information on that. But the banks on the deal, I'm pretty sure, have done the due diligence and we're at least comfortable with what they've seen so far. And given the investors going in, it gives me hope that that's nothing to worry about. So. And then, of course, we have a bunch of M&A. But before I move on, did anybody want to say anything about this IPO? I take silence as a no. I'm going to carry on. And of course, we've got the Revolution Medicine. Now, it's a company that we've held with high regard in our BI research. As you all know, we don't do buy, sell, hold recommendations or any price targets or anything like that. But we've done a very deep analysis of the KRAS data set. A RAS data set, Revolution Medicine, that's their focus. And they have a very powerful engine in terms of developing these novel agents, the drugs, theirs and the other drugs that are coming up from Roche, Lilly, Merck are potentially better they are better in terms of the evidence and data that we're seeing, efficacy data and safety profile potentially, than the first generation, I would say, from now Bristol, which was Mirati, and Amgen. So the news was AbbVie is looking to buy, and I think that was Wall Street Journal a couple of nights ago. And remember, I'm in Europe, so things tend to end up being nights for me. And then that came from Wall Street Journal, and I think Bloomberg then phoned them up and they said, no, we're not in discussions. Those are the phrases. I don't know what that means. And then the next day, Financial Times has reported that Merck is in discussion. So, and the price they've mentioned is $28 to $32 billion, which is a pretty hefty price by looking at EV to sales multiples of recent deals and oncology deals going back to Loxo and Array all the time ago. So whatever method you use to compare the valuation, that would be a rich valuation if that ends up being the case. But as enthusiasts for the biotech sector, if Merck is prepared to pay that, then that'd be great because there's a pile of cash coming into the sector. And the history and story of Revolution Medicine is interesting because remember there was a deal they did with EQRx where they took the cash from that company and merged and funded their pretty hefty R&D efforts here. So before I move on, does anybody want to comment on that? I think I can't imagine anybody would disagree that this would be good for the sector. Yeah.
No disagreement.
No disagreement, but that's good. Can we just keep it like this? And what's interesting, of course, is that their key asset is a pan-RAS inhibitor that they've got daraxonrasib. And then just a couple of days before, or a week before, I can't remember exactly, it's been such a hectic week, AstraZeneca announced they did a deal with China's Jacobio, 100 million upfront and up to close to $2 billion of milestones for a pan-RAS inhibitor, on which we haven't seen a huge amount of data. It's but I'm assuming that there's data in-house and that's seen just the same as these M&A deals. So that's looking pretty good. And but then you have to say, okay, well, RevMed's obviously a lot further. They've got products in phase the drugs in phase 3, particularly pancreatic, could be on the market in a couple of years, where there is massive unmet need. So, and then of course the last deal that happened was Lilly VTYX, which actually happened. So this Revolution one is a rumor, whereas Lilly announced the deal. And I guess this goes to what was it Brian or Paul said that things seem to be coming forward. The deal was announced before JPM, but I think that might be because there was some rumors on the market on that.
Yeah, I meant more on the secondary offering side, but I mean the point probably holds on M&A too.
Yeah, I mean usually they wait for JPM to give it a bit of extra boost, right? Anyway, so anything else anyone wants to mention on the deal side? I think there's been quite a lot of follow-ons, as you said, Brian. Is it possible that it's going to end up being the strongest first week of January in follow-on land? I don't know.
It's it's a lot of money that's gone around, and it's notable. I think they're all meaningfully up from price. I mean, I know looking at the names that are on my list that had deals this week, they're all double digits. I mean, and all of the names were able to upsize. Imagine the shoes are exercised on all of them. So I mean, I think follow-on performance is a great indicator for the level of enthusiasm there is out there. Certainly, there's capital to put to work.
Yeah, so since you've got the mic, we're going to move to data, and you've got, I call it Crinetics. I don't know if it's Crinetics. Pharmaceuticals, nice share price chart I'm looking at here, a big jump in the new year. Tell us what's going on there.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is one of the interesting case studies to kind of prove my point that there is both data pulled forward and a follow-on pull forward. So they early announced metrics on their Palsonify launch. This is a new drug that was approved second half of 2025. This is really the first quarter of sales. I mean, we had a couple of weeks of data when they announced third quarter, so fourth quarter sales the first quarter, and it's really outperformed the consensus number. I think we had wrote up probably more importantly, we think that really outperformed in terms of the number of enrollment forms, the 200 enrollment forms, which is very robust for this size indication right now. And I think it's, you're seeing people revise their models upwards. You know, Outperforming launches are always ways for stocks to go up, but they also topped it off that they had some pretty impressive data from an additional cohort of a phase 2 study they're running in congenital adrenal hyperplasia. The data looked really impressive on both biomarkers and reduction of glucocorticoids, which are the standard of care that obviously carry at high doses very significant side effects. And part of this disease, the goal is to get patients to lower levels of glucocorticoids. I think part of the story here is Neurocrine has a drug, Chronicity, that's launched really well in CAH. Also, I think outperforming expectations by a meaningful amount. So, people are looking at this data and saying there's really good competitive data in an indication that seems to be larger than people expected. So, I think Chronetics use the opportunity to raise additional cash. Again, right now it's trading about 21% up from the offer price. So, in 4 days time, 3 days time, that's a pretty good response to a follow on.
Yeah, well, it's not all been a bed of roses, right? So Tess is going to talk to us about Zenas, and then at the back end of last year we had Ultragenyx. So Zenas is interesting because the press release had a positive headline, and then the share price collapsed. So talk us through that.
Absolutely. Yeah, so maybe just starting with Zenas and a bit of an overview of what they have. So because there was a lot of excitement, I think, coming into the readout that they shared at the beginning of this year. Which they have a drug for IgG4 related related disease. And this is, essentially a CD19, factor 2b, factor 2b drug. And so the pitch is that, hey, you're actually targeting, the CD19 cell, the CD19, expressing plasma cells, but also some of these, some of these earlier, cell types like plasmablasts. And the pitch was that this co-engagement, could potentially make this drug more potent than a drug like Uplizna, which is really just focused on CD19. I think the cross trial comparison, ended up not looking as great, right? So when you looked at, flares, which is I think what a lot of people were focused on, the Zenas's drug, sorry, I just want to make sure I pronounce it right, obexelimab. So obexelimab, when you looked at their flare reduction, it was about 56%, but then Uplizna has something closer to 87%. So I think, there was, I think that's where a lot of the disappointment came from, was this focus on flare reduction. And, what does this mean for, from a competitive landscape standpoint? And I think once the baseline characteristics came out, there wasn't anything that really stood out as explaining why that would be meaningfully different. So the companies they're moving forward, and they have a filing that's actually coming up. They're going to be filing in the U.S. FDA and EMA, and I think they're excited to bring this forward. And it'll be a question of what they point to, and really how they compete in the marketplace. They do have they are focused on just a weekly sub-Q dosing, and that's certainly a differentiation from Uplizna. So that'll be that'll certainly be worth watching.
Sorry, couldn't find the mute button. Yeah, so did you want to also just talk about Ultragenyx, and then I'm going to ask you to talk about some positive stuff?
Yes, absolutely. So this probably feels like ages ago for everyone, because we had the Christmas break and everything like that. But actually, over the holidays, Ultragenyx, released a very highly anticipated, trial results for setrusumab, which is their drug for osteogenesis imperfecta. And if you recall, their whole thesis, for setrusumab was there was this, pretty phenomenal, pretty phenomenal data that they had observed in, I think a phase 2 study that showed, pretty, pretty awesome fracture risk reduction, as well as BMD changes. And what was really a surprise from the setrusumab study, so if you recall, this study was structured with a number of interims. And so there was an interim 1 that, was maybe going to read out in the first part of the year. There was an interim 2 that was around mid-year. And then this was really the final analysis. And they actually had 2 trials going, and it was kind of sequenced depending on, whether these interims hit and, the final analysis in the one trial, how they would look at, the other trial. One being a trial that compared to placebo, and the other being a trial where they were looking, versus biphosphonates, also in different, in different osteogenesis imperfecta patient populations. And the first interim did not hit. The second interim, did not hit either. Expectations were certainly lower going into this result, but nonetheless, I think there was, there was a surprise just to see that, the endpoints, the endpoint on fracture rate did not materialize. So there was not statistical significance. There were secondary endpoint improvements in bone mineral densities, and the safety profile looked pretty consistent with what they had before. I think it'll be very interesting to better understand, these data, and understand what what the path forward is in terms of Ultragenyx discussing with the FDA. I think we're anticipating, we're hoping for an update around JP Morgan, just to get some more details on the potential path forward here.
And so now onto something good, where the share price direction went in the opposite direction. Tess, was obviously Monte Rosa with their data and one of those followers that Brian was talking about. So do you want to just touch on that before I move on to Paul to talk about Neumora?
Yes, absolutely. So I think, Monte Rosa came out, Monte Rosa data came out. They were pursuing a NEX7 degrader. And this was is they were looking at this in healthy volunteers, but the potential market opportunity is a pretty it's a pretty big market opportunity, because it would essentially be going after cardiovascular risk, right? So ASCVD, very big market. You can think of this as a drug that would compete with tourmaline's drug, right? The IL-6. Novo Nordisk also has an IL-6. I think we're expecting outcomes data for IL-6 coming out around, potentially later this year from Novo Nordisk. And it was really impressive to see, some of the biomarker impacts of their NEX7 degrader. So they had a HSCRP reduction that came in around 85%, and I think the IL-6 were something around 65%. This was quite interesting. And then we also saw, speaking of CRP reductions, Ventyx, right? Speaking of CRP reductions, and speaking of deals, Ventyx showed a CRP reduction that was also in that range. So I think this was obviously a really big positive for Monte Rosa, that's clearly found a really interesting and attractive market for their technology here.
Thanks for that. Do we have Paul back on? No, doesn't sound like it. So I was gonna be all nice and not go straight to myself again, but he's not on. Let me just check again. Paul, are you there? No, he's having trouble with his ex today, so never mind. I'm sure
Hey,
he's been
Stan,
talking
can you
about.
hear me now?
Here you are. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Neumora and GH
I
Research.
don't know what the deal is, man. Okay, thanks. Yeah, well, Neumora had an interesting week because of the Ventyx takeout, and the stock reacted well to that, as you would expect, because they have an NLRP3 as well with some data later this year. But earlier this week, they put out data for their V1AR program in Alzheimer's agitation that, from my discussions with investors, I think has been kind of seen from a couple different angles. Some that view it optimistically, some that view it skeptically. Essentially, the study showed a small trend for their drug versus placebo on an agitation scale. Alzheimer's agitation is like a huge unmet medical need, probably, which goes without saying. Super tough to treat, right? Really hard to have a drug that can kind of help patients feel less agitated, but also, sort of thread the needle on like side effects, like things like somnolence, sedation, things like that. So the opportunity here, if they can get it right, is enormous. But on the primary sort of outcome, right? And again, this wasn't powered. The effect size wasn't huge, and also like the data as it was shown was not totally an intent to treat data set with all patients. They did talk about a subset that they were excited about in patients with elevated levels of anxiety, where the effect size is potentially bigger. They talk about that aligning better with the mechanism. I would say, from being someone who's followed a lot of these psychiatry readouts over the years and has gotten excited about things that look promising early and don't hold up, I almost feel like in neuropsych, and I would include agitation in that bucket, like you kind of want data in a phase 1b study that is super clean, because you kind of have to bank on there being, some meaningful level of regression in your effect size in future trials. So our interpretation here was somewhat more cautious. But given the upside opportunity, it's certainly understandable why they try to pursue this signal further. And then, I think the other interesting news this week, and, I can probably also comment on another psychedelics name as well, came from GH Research, who has one of the best data sets we've seen for any psychedelic in treatment-resistant depression. They are developing a inhaled formulation of 5-MeO DMT, and they put out their data about a year ago that had a 15-point difference between drug and placebo in the MADRS. For context, the average drug has about a 3-point difference. Certainly, that study comes with some caveats. It was not a huge trial. Placebo effects were modest, and I think people wonder with a lot of these psychedelic trials around functional unblinding, but the data looked really, really good. And from an efficacy perspective, it looks fairly de-risked. They had run into this very odd situation on an FDA clinical hold, where they had already run multiple clinical trials outside of the US, including this large phase 2b that even had an open label extension. And yet the FDA kept holding them up from filing an IND due to this rat tox issue, that there was a lot of precedent that this may have been a rat model specific issue. They did a dog tox model that looked clean. And so they finally got this off hold and are ready to advance into phase 3. As if it's not already clear, like we think this is a super promising approach. And I just think, broadly speaking, for psychedelics, like we're seeing now Spravato from J&J move towards being a $3 to $4 billion drug in the next handful of years. And I think that really validates the market more broadly. But good setup here for GH to advance into phase 3 later this year. The next catalyst in this space that we're watching is going to be the Compass data this quarter from their psilocybin product, from their second phase 3, and also from their long-term durability study. And that, I think that durability piece continues to be one of the biggest questions for these next-gen psychedelics from two angles. One, I think, not to imply that the bar is high, but I still think it's a little bit gray on exactly how the FDA is going to be interpreting durability data for these drugs. If you look at Spravato, it's given on a fixed interval, right? But these other next generation psychedelics are trying to explore this idea of like PRN or as needed dosing, right? And I think that gets into a really, really interesting question from the FDA, like what data do you need to see to be comfortable in sort of maintenance of benefit, and how open-minded are you to just totally leave this up to physicians? But, I think we're positively biased going into this Compass data because we already have decent enough durability evidence for psilocybin. And I also think in the real world, like a lot of these TRD patients will probably be getting a psychedelic on top of another medication like an SSRI. But certainly a really big year for this space. Instead of GH going into phase 3, you've got this Compass phase 3, you've got MindMed phase 3 readouts, you've got Spravato crushing it. So it's an area where for me, like, back when Compass went public and a lot of the data were from these academic studies with poor placebo controls, there's just like so many reasons to be skeptical. And I think the tide has, I'm not even talking about the kind of RFK bull case. I mean, I think even outside of that, right, let's just assume these have to go through a psych division that is, stringent to the normal standard. I still think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic on this category.
That's a perfect segue to Brian to talk about drug to us. Brian, do you want to go on that? I mean, I just have to say, from a ticker perspective, I think it's got the best ticker out there, bar DNA, I suppose. Brian?
Yeah, so Bright Minds Biosciences, they had new data in two different epilepsy indications, absence epilepsy and a sort of a basket study of developmental epilepsies. And it's phase 2. It's open label, so we're not looking at placebo controlled. And I think Paul wants to comment a little bit on sort of the consistency of open label data in epilepsy and decrease in seizures on an open label basis and how that corroborates. But I think we thought looked really good. Certainly, there's a number of programs that have gotten approved on open label data on large data sets in DEs specifically. And we saw very good mean reductions in these DE patients. Small study, but 63.3%, which is certainly on the upper end, if not the highest end of open label seizure reductions that we've seen. Again, this is sort of a basket of different DEEs, and what's also interesting is we saw very, very good reductions, 73% in absence seizures, which really hasn't been an area that people have been focused on in drug development. It doesn't quite have the same patient numbers or patient numbers that are unmet when you talk to docs about it, but these studies seem to enroll pretty quickly. So I think given the relative dearth of new drugs in absence seizures, they're planning on moving into two pivotal programs here. I think it'll be 2 studies for each of the indications, so probably 4 phase 3 studies. But certainly the mechanism makes sense. It's another mechanism that has seen recent approvals. We think this looks better than like bexicaserin, which is the most recent one to get approved in epileptic seizure indications. And that's been another one. They did a financing on the back of it, and it's sitting here today, 37% up from the offering price of $90. So it was well received, and continues to be well received in the market. I don't know if Paul wanted to comment a little bit. I know we both follow that seizure space.
Yeah, well, I just, yeah, Brian, you know this name a lot better than me, but I know the drug, and like I've been following the category for a while. I just thought it was like interesting, like, how can everyone hear me, by the way?
Yeah, you
Sure
sound
can.
brilliant.
It's just so annoying. I don't know what's going on, guys. Sorry.
You're good. Well, now you're not.
You were doing so well,
Yeah,
Paul.
I mean, I have to say, Paul's sound is the best amongst all of us. I literally have to turn the volume down when he's speaking. I'm sure he'll be back, but Brian, you've got another one, which is yet another positive news and yet another fundraise. Do you want to talk us through that, Alumis?
Yes. So, I mean, this is another name like I've been really excited about. Been talking a lot about it, especially it's all through last year, really. Alumis is a company developing a novel TYK2 inhibitor called envudeucitinib. This has been like a really interesting process to follow through. So TYK2 really kind of came into the spotlight from Bristol Myers. They were developing a drug that is approved now, deucravacitinib, branded under the name TYK2. And it was interesting when Bristol acquired Celgene, they wound up having to divest Celgene's Otezla, and Amgen famously purchased it. And Amgen's like really been absolutely smashing it with Otezla in plaque psoriasis, and I think a lot of us thought Otezla would never really be a big drug before it was approved, even in early days in commercial, and it's really done remarkably well for a drug that I would say is not very effective. It's oral, so it has an advantage over on a convenience factor over a lot of the other I&I drugs that are used in the space. Biologics are sort of the mainstay of post-oral therapy. Otezla doesn't work anywhere near as well. Bristol chose to divest it. They had to do so on an FTC basis to focus on Sotyktu. Everyone thought Sotyktu was going to be a huge drug because they did head-to-head phase 3s against Otezla and were shown to be superior to Otezla. And I got to say, it's now been on the market for a number of years, and it's been, commercially very, very disappointing. I think there's a variety of factors there, but it sort of led to a lot of skepticism about TYK2 inhibition as a class. And I've sort of remained very bullish on the potential as a class, and thought there's some liabilities that Sotyktu has that hopefully second generation TYK2s would get. But people really had their doubts, and I think these were compounded last year by J&J, which put out really great data for an oral IL-23 inhibitor. Showing on efficacy on par with biologics. I mean, injectable IL-23 antibodies are really kind of the mainstay standard of care in psoriasis right now. So J&J putting up this really fantastic phase 3 data, and what's big selling point in here is sort of the high hurdles of like PASI 90, PASI 100. You're talking about over half of patients getting to PASI 90 on icotrokinra, 30 to 40% of patients getting fully PASI 100 scores, which is really, you just really don't see with oral drugs at all. But now we've had 2 data points from 2 TYK2 inhibitors over the last 2 months, both Alumis, which I think was really great data, and Takeda with their drug TAK-279 last month, basically showing what I would argue is very much on par with J&J's oral IL-23. And I think it kind of like just reframes the whole market opportunity here, where we're now seeing, these really potent TYK2 inhibitors or oral IL-23 inhibitors, which are showing efficacy that is on par with biologics. And, I think that's creating a lot of enthusiasm here. I think one of the additional benefits of all these mechanisms, these are implicated in a lot of I&I diseases, and, have the potential to expand well beyond just sort of plaque psoriasis, which I think we understand they're very efficacious for now, but psoriatic arthritis, potentially moving into IBD with like ulcerative colitis. Bristol has phase 3 data with Sotyktu in SLE this year. Alumis has phase 2 data with their TYK2 envudeucitinib in SLE this year. So this has really become a story that I think people are starting to get really excited about, as we see the not only that it's matching the potential of these biologics, but really has the opportunity to be classes that have pipeline in a drug more than just the potential. I think it's becoming very clear that they are going to expand into multiple indications.
Hey, Brian, with these next gen TYK2s, like, is showing better efficacy enough, or like is the problem with this not taking off really more on the safety tolerability side? And Otezla is less efficacious, but it's seen as oral and super safe, and the branding is great.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element of that, and I guess I would argue that the efficacy, that's probably what really drowned out Sotyktu, that you just have so much better opportunity to go to high efficacy biologics, and I think TYK2, certainly from like the historical investor perspective, I guess I would argue less among the treating physician perspective, but sort of has this association with JAK2, which it has, or JAK inhibitors that have had more significant safety. But look, I mean, as we've seen more and more data, not just within like the TYK2 class, but within the JAK class, right? I mean, you look at like Pfizer's first generation and the commercial performance there, and you could follow that for years and be like, oh, it's doing terrible. But like now you look at AbbVie with Rinvoq, and I mean, it's like one of the biggest oral drugs in the world, right? So I think over time the data has proven out that there aren't, when you get to more selectivity for just TYK2, you really do get away from a lot of these safety issues, and nothing across the Alumis data or the Takeda data so far would indicate that there's some sort of safety issue to really be concerned about. And I think as we get more and more exposure, to that, you'll sort of see that dynamic shift where people will look at the class and say, no, this is like a really, really effective class, and the safety is not something to be concerned about with these more selective agents.
And Paul, now that we got you back, did you want to go back and comment on the epilepsy side, or you're good to go?
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah. Can you hear me, Sam?
Yeah, clear
All right.
again.
Sweet. Yeah, I wanted to ask Skorney a question, just like what he would say to this sort of not pushback, but like, so from following some of these open label data sets in epilepsy, I cover GW, Zogenix, I cover Rapport, I follow Xenon, and people look at the Praxis as competitive. Like it does seem like open label to placebo controlled, depending on the sample size of patients, you can have a pretty big regression in effect size. And I remember Zogenix had this 55% seizure reduction in LGS and a open label study that was like something like 12 patients, and then it was, I think it was like 25% in an RCT. And so I understand you have the mechanistic validation, but how do you or how do other investors get comfortable that the drug product is actually better, especially something like absence seizures, which are so subjective to codify? Like I don't know how you really can tease that out in a small N like that. But I'm not as close to it as you.
Yeah, but look, I mean, I think it's I think taking open label data and then trying to figure out like the point estimate for placebo adjusted effect size is really hard. I mean, I guess I would argue if you get into like, very specific subgroups where you have, better historical data on understanding, baseline seizure frequency, what those patients look like, how many different anti-seizure meds they're on, you can get a little more consistent, which is why I think we've seen more and more focus on sort of not just going after like a broad set of seizures, but like, oh, we're going to go for CDLK5, we're going to go for Lennox-Gastaut, really target this more and more. But certainly, I don't, I'm not going to look at, this uncontrolled data and say, oh, in absence, a 73% seizure reduction, like that's what the, placebo controlled is going to be. Absolutely not. And it's going to be even hard to look at what you think placebo control will be, because to your point, there's a lot of subjectivity here. But I guess I kind of look at it and you could say, well, you certainly can predict whether or not it's like efficacious. So like at 73% in absence, 63% in DEEs. I mean, this is a really high number, and right, we both see this. I get this to some extent on debate on some of the Praxis data as well. But it's not a question of like, does it? I think we answer a big part of the question of like, does it work? Is it reasonably probable to hit in a phase 3 study? What you get into a more nuanced debate around is like how robust is it going to be a 45% delta between placebo and treatment? And yeah, I don't know that I'd be reasonably comfortable saying that there's going to be a stat sig delta. What would you power for? Would you power for a 30% delta? Maybe, probably. I'd probably say be a little more conservative. But I think at this point, what you're really looking for is drugs that are safe, that are convenient, that very clearly show efficacy on top of multiple anti-seizure meds. But yeah, I hear you. Like I would, I'm a big advocate for always randomizing placebo patients in every study that one ever does, if it's not unethical.
I think this conversation that you guys just had proves is the real reason why this Twitter Spaces, this podcast or whatever you want to call it, conversation is so valuable. I mean, that sort of detail that you guys went into is gold dust. So thank you for that. Well done. I didn't want to end the first session of 2026 without a comment on obesity. Because I think that would be a very, very bad thing to do. We've had the biggest fundraise came from Arrowhead, which had some siRNA data in the space, early stage data. The drug is I don't know how to call it, inhibi. Okay, there you go, inhibi. Phase 2 is moving into phase 2 and shows some interesting benefits in particularly diabetic obese patients. But there was some angles in here that did make us scratch our heads about how the regulatory pathway would form. The drug monotherapy in obese patients didn't do anything. I think it's fair to say that, and knock me down if you'd like to. But it worked really well in combination with, I think it was, I can't remember, was it tirzepatide it was combination with? Yes. In the obese diabetics, it was a brilliant effect, and the data, we've done a full comparison looking at different aspects of, and they showed quite a lot of detail with the visceral adipose tissue, total adipose tissue, liver fat content. I mean, it really did a fantastic job. I'm not going to go into the detail of the mechanism of action and it's not a GLP-1, so let's put that there. Similar to what Wave is doing, and I think they did a pretty good job here. Clearly, the market loved it because they ended up having a upsized raise of $625 million. So well done to them. And I think it's a very interesting. These are more and more of these novel modalities that are coming along now. I think maybe the story of GLP-1s is last year's story, and this year is going to be more about these other ways of either bringing new additional weight loss or helping weight loss in a situation where you want more fat loss versus muscle loss. A lot of this has to be figured out still, but clearly, the market size hasn't changed. And of course, you've got the other changes in the commercial side with oral Wegovy pricing at a level that is relatively accessible, etc. So that was a good start to the year from an obesity perspective. Yeah, and Tess, did you want to add anything here?
I think the only thing I'd add is I absolutely agree with you, Sam, in terms of some of these mechanisms that people have been excited about and are awaiting data readouts for. So maybe just adding to Arrowhead, they had the data for NAB. And they also have an ALK7, and these are both, these are essentially both going after the same pathway to with different parts of the same pathway to essentially help obese patients. And they didn't yet report data on the ALK7, but that data is forthcoming. And I think we have a few other targets like that where we'll hope to see data at some point this year or maybe next.
Yeah, I think this is where we're looking forward to seeing that particular data on the improving lipolysis with the ALK7 target, which is I think really exciting. And these are what we really want to see is safety. And so far, this seems to have been quite safe. As RNA or small nucleotide approaches to these things do worry you a little bit, especially if they're the mode of action is the target is the liver itself in some of these situations. So I think we can end there. Of course, we did have a bad news from Sanofi on their tolebrutinib, but I don't think we need to particularly go into that. I don't want to end on a negative. I think we're doing very well ending on a positive. So
I was going to just
Tess,
sorry,
guys?
Sam. I just wanted to jump in it because you brought up the oral Wegovy, and I think one of the interesting things to just follow on just sort of the politics side is orforglipron, Lilly's oral GLP-1, I think is like, they've submitted that for the Commissioner's National Priority Review, and I think they've been talking about like approval in January. I think this is really interesting when we look at like the initial set of National Priority Review vouchers under the CNPV. I think a lot of us kind of scratch our heads whether it has any real impact. But this is potentially like a real big impact and a real big indication. And kind of, when I think of all the things that HHS has done, and I think we probably criticize them a lot. I mean, this is actually something that could, meaningfully move up present values on things. And if, big drugs that are of great interest are moving from a 12-month review cycle to a 2-month review cycle, that's kind of a big deal.
It is. It certainly helped the Novo's share price, which was on a one direction slide for pretty much most of the year. What's interesting, of course, it's going to be interesting to watch the battle between these two orals. You've got Wegovy with a slightly better weight loss, around 14%, versus a problem of dosing in terms of needing the scheduling and when you take the drug, versus a 12% weight loss with orforglipron, but it's an oral drug. So it's a real oral drug. And of course, supply, there's 10 times more dose in the 25 milligram oral Wegovy versus 2.4 milligram injectable. So that's going to be interesting to watch. And I have to say, when I saw the national, remind me what it's called again, designation for Tecvayli in myeloma, I was really excited. I mean, this is something that you would have thought would take another 9 months okay, it's an already approved drug to get to market for these second line patients in multiple myeloma. And the results were spectacular in the patient groups that were tested. And they've got that. So is it possible that it's going to come in Q1? We'll see. So we're on the hour. Anyone want to close with anything that's positive? No negatives allowed? No, that looks like that's it. So enjoy JP Morgan next week, folks. Do not come back with infections or anything. Hopefully, everybody comes back fully charged with lots of excitement for the year. I look forward to speaking. I think we have another session next Friday. And thank you very much for joining. I do have one thing that I have to finish with, of course, and that is that if you're heading to JPM next week, Biotech Hangouts got an in-person networking event on Tuesday, January 13th from 7 to 10 p.m. I wish I was there. At Persona is the place where it is at, which is the same location as the past 2 years. We hope to see everybody there, except I won't be there and I'm very sad, for a fun night on open bar, which is dangerous. Thanks to our gold badge sponsors, CFGO and Incubate Coalition, and our blue badge sponsors, FTI Consulting, Catalytic Agency, and Mispro. Be sure to RSVP, please. The registration link will be reshared shortly on the Biotech Hangout social media channel, January 13th from 7 to 10 p.m. on Tuesday.